Good evening. Hi, everyone. My name's Jana. I'm the head of public programs and research here at Nottingham Contemporary. It's great to see so many people out tonight at this event that's called the Grand Tour Revisited. And this is an event surrounding the thematic of the show that is upstairs, which I'm sure many of you have had the chance to see. And if you haven't, I encourage you to do so, in which the artist Pablo Bronstein has worked with a collection of Chatsworth House. The exhibition is part of a collaboration across the Midlands, in which contemporary artists have engaged with historical collections. This is part one of a two-part series called the Grand Tour. Though these exhibitions aren't explicitly about the Grand Tour, they reference it in two central ways. One, by featuring objects and collections that were acquired during various Grand Tours throughout history, but also as an initiative to encourage contemporary tourism to the Midlands, which is a kind of tourism that draws its legacy from the Grand Tour tradition that we'll hear about tonight. Tonight's panel has been conceived by NTU's Carl Thompson and Sharon Ouditt, who are sitting on the panel, as a way to introduce different aspects of the Grand Tour. And they're joined by Tim Knox, who's also a Grand Tour collections expert. The session's going to be hopefully quite dynamic, looking at the Grand Tour from its various inclusions and exclusions, its historical foundations and also its contemporary legacies. And we're very, very fortunate tonight to have with us as our host the eminent historian and broadcaster Kate Williams. Drawing from her own experience and expertise on studying women of the Grand Tour in relation to the Grand Tour, Kate will pose a series of questions and then we'll open it up to the audience. So if things arise as the panelists are in their discussion, just hold on to them, and at some point we'll open up to the audience and you'll be welcome to pose questions for the panelists or for the rest of the room. Kate, as many of you likely know, is a historian, a broadcaster, and a specialist in modern history, royal and constitutional affairs. She's Professor of Modern History at Reading University, was the co-presenter of BBC Two's Restoration Home, and has contributed to many historical shows on television, including her BBC Two's Young Victoria. She appears often on Radio 4 programs, including Today, Women's Hour, PM, World at 1, and World Tonight, as well as on Radio 2 shows, including the Jeremy Vine and Chris Evans shows. Kate is a New York Times best-selling author of 6 historical books. Her biography of Josephine Bonaparte is being made into a major TV series, and her biography of Emma Hamilton is being made into a film. So we're really lucky to have Kate with us tonight, and she's going to be our kind of host for the evening and introduce the rest of the panelists. So thank you, Kate, and thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Jana, for that very generous introduction. And I'm going to ask my first and most important question. Can you all hear me? Yes, you can hear me. So I'm going to watch carefully. So if you ever can't hear anything that we're saying, give us a good wave and I'll spot you and talk up. Because especially these people have wonderful projecting voices, but I have a rather quiet one, so I'll talk up. So we're delighted to see you all here. It's really fantastic to see you all here to be part of our panel really looking into the Grand Tour and exploring the Grand Tour. And it's very exciting for me to hear about what Nottingham Contemporary is doing and what everyone's doing about this, investigating the treasures of the Midlands and the treasures of Nottingham. I'm from Birmingham, so the treasures of Midlands hopefully includes me, I would say. In my mind. So it's really fantastic to see that happening. And I think it's really wonderful to bring the Grand Tour away just from the perceptions it was something in the 18th century into the modern day. So very thrilling. So I'm really delighted to be joined by such an eminent and such an expert panel who knows so much about the Grand Tour that we're going to have to fight, I think, to keep. We could still be here at 11, but we won't be. But we could be with all this brilliant stuff that everyone knows for so much. So Carl Thompson here is from Nottingham Trent. He's the reader in English literature and travel writing, and he's written on huge amounts of things, from romantic literature, particularly on travel. We were old PhD chums, and Carl was writing brilliant stuff on travel then, and is still doing brilliant stuff on travel now. So travel and travel theory, particularly on shipwrecks and women travellers and women's travel writing. He's written many fascinating books, including The Suffering Traveller and The Romantic Imagination, and most recently Sarah Wilson, The Fruits of Enterprise. So marvellous books. And then we have Tim Knox here in the middle, who's a British art and architectural historian. He is director of the wonderful Fitzwilliam Museum, and he studied history of art at the Courtauld Institute, and then he was at an assistant curator at the British Architects Drawings Collection for the National Trust as his architectural historian, and then head curator. And then he was the director of the John Soanes Museum, which we all know and love so much. And he looked at a lot of restoration work, and now, as I said, he's doing marvellous things in the Fitzwilliam Museum. And last but very much not least, we have Sharon, who's at the end, who is also at Nottingham Trent University, and she focuses on gender and sexuality and literature, as well as historic travel writing in the 18th and 19th century, published lots on this subject, including Walking in the Footsteps of the Illustrious Dead, 19th Century Travellers in Southern Italy, and most recently, Impressions of Southern Italy, British Travel Writing from Henry Swinburne to Norman Douglas. So I think this obviously necessitates, Sharon, lots of urgent and important research trips to Italy as part of this work.
Yes, it's definitely part
it's all necessary.
life, yeah.
I mean, I myself suffered while researching Emma Hamilton. I had to go to Naples, and I also thought I'd better check out Antigua, where Nelson was, just in case. It was vital research, and Josephine having to go to Martinique. So we're thrilled to have you with us, and I thought we might start off in a general sense. So, sometimes there's a perception, isn't there? I might start with you, Carl, do you mind? Sometimes there's a perception, isn't there, the Grand Tour. It's lots of 18th century aristocratic chaps who've just come out of Oxbridge, and they just set off around Europe, not really minding that there are wars going on around them, set off around Europe, having loads of fun, buying marvellous paintings. It's up from the Ouditt nightclub binge, but it's still having lots of fun, and then it's really killed by the railway age. But is it more complex than that?
Well, I think in many ways can you all hear me? Okay, by the way? Yeah. That is a fairly accurate summary of the Grand Tour in its sort of heyday. People may want to. There's scholarly debate about when you say it starts, when you say it ends. There's scholarly debate about whether it has changed beyond recognition by the time you get to the 19th century. But it begins really in the sort of late 16th century, as you say, becomes a convention for young aristocrats, particularly at that time, to go abroad to France and Italy, learn languages, make contacts at courts, which will be very useful in future diplomatic careers, to pick up useful knowledge across all the disciplines and all the sort of aspects of knowledge, so to find out about economies, political systems, how local states are run, and then to submerge themselves above all in the culture of these different areas, and to soak up things like it begins in a period where England is a very backward nation, where the Renaissance is only just starting to happen. And aristocrats start to flock to France, and particularly Italy, where they have such wonderful inventions as the fork, which has come in and started to be fashionable.
Fork?
You don't just chop your meat up with your knife
and eat a bit of bread.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
Use a fork.
You use a fork. The fan is coming in, a Middle Eastern thing.
You're not saying that the French do things better, are you?
The Italians certainly do in this period. And so, yes, going back to your summary, they are flooding down there to soak up these influences, gain this knowledge, along with the fork and the fan, to pick up, to soak themselves in art and the revival of art and architecture, which I think Tim will talk about. And that's the overt purpose of the Grand Tour, really, through the 17th and 18th centuries, with the underlying purpose, perhaps, like you said, of also going down and sending some young men just at the age when they might be impregnating chambermaids and serving girls to sow their wild oats sort of discreetly overseas, where the repercussions are less
Fingers
awkward.
crossed.
Awkward for families at home. Yeah, it becomes called the Grand Tour. I should perhaps say this starts really in the late 16th century. It becomes more established as a pattern across the 17th century, with interruptions because of the Civil War, the warfare, some of the wars in Europe. But by the end of the 17th century, it's been called the Grand Tour by a man called Richard Lascelles. And then, really, the 18th century, it's then fixed as a young aristocrat, and also by this point, gentry tradition for young men to do this loop.
So they're all round 18 to 25, let loose on Europe.
Yeah, that sort of age, sometimes a little bit younger, actually. It's an age when you could go to Oxford and Cambridge and do your degree at 14. So sometimes they've done their degree at sort of 14, 15, and then they go after that. It is classic form, yeah. You're talking young men in their late teens through to mid to late 20s.
So did you really, is it that you really had to go to fit into contemporary society? If you wanted to be a cultured aristocrat in Britain, you had to go on the Grand Tour?
It was very much a mark of sort of distinction. There's a lovely quote from Dr. Johnson in the latter part of the 18th century, where he says, "A man who has never been to Italy is always conscious of an inferiority from not having seen what it is supposed a man should see." because you haven't been to Italy. So it is a mark of breeding. It's a rite of passage for young elite men. You come back and you have the polish of the courts. You have also the polish, I say, of increasing aspect of it in the 18th century is the encounter with classical Rome and the legacies of classical Rome. So you have all the sort of sophistication that comes from that as well.
And so, Sharon, where were they actually going? So, if I was a grand tourist in the 18th century, wandering around Calais would not be enough, would it?
I think you'd have to go a bit further than Calais, yes. I think at the beginning, Paris was the big lure, because, well, people did apparently do things so well there.
The fork.
Yeah, the fork, and the language. Of course, French was the diplomatic language of the time. So young men, if they were looking for a career in the diplomatic service, they would be going there to perfect their language skills, apart from anything else. All the roads to Paris were good. And then from there, they would head down towards the Alps. They might get on a boat and go round and then get into Italy from there. Or they might cross the Alps themselves. And if they were in a carriage, that would involve taking apart the carriage, giving the bits to your servants to carry, and then either walking, or if you're really posh, being picked up and carried in a sedan chair.
So they just dumped the horses?
I think the horses were probably walked, but it's the carriage that got me.
So they dismantled. So there must be there'd be a strange sort of inn just next to the Alps where everyone was dismantling their carriages.
Yes, and packing them up like little IKEA
like a pit
things.
Stop next to F1.
Yeah, putting them in their carry cases. And then going across.
Some local chaps must have earned a huge amount of being fast carriage dismantlers.
I think that would have been quite a career opportunity. One we've lost.
So I dismantle my carriage and then I set off over the Alps.
You set off over the Alps. If you're sensible, I think you probably go round. But some people, the Alps. Particularly in
I want the views, so the sublime views.
You want the sublime. So, particularly by the time we get to the Romantic period, you've got to give in to the sublime. That's part of the whole experience. It's part of the whole sort of distinction thing. I mean, Carl was talking about the cultural mark that the Grand Tour gave, and as the period goes on, that becomes as much interior as exterior. So as much as you will want to learn skills, you learn to dance, you learn your languages, you learn to behave in polite company. You would also learn the sensibility, the ability to appreciate the sublime, and that would be a mark of distinction as well. So then, having dismantled your carriage, done the sublime bit, got down the other side, then you would go through Italy, and the key stops on the way down would be Florence and Rome. Then, if you were brave, you'd go to Naples. We might talk a little bit more about that later. And then you'd probably pick up Venice on the way back, and then you would either come back again through France, or you might take in more of Germany, more of the Low Countries, and come back that way.
So generally, for a lot of people, the Grand Tour was going around France and Italy.
At the beginning, certainly, yes, it was mostly France and Italy.
But you could get some Germany, and of course Byron went trundling off into all kinds of exciting places.
Yes, well, Byron was his own thing. He was his own tour guide. So.
His own tour guide. And so why was Naples quite so terrifying?
Naples was terrifying, partly because it was a different kingdom. I think whereas the north of France was, the states were principalities, and they had their own princes, their own organisation. They were kind of in competition with each other, and that kind of kept them civilised. Naples was run by the Bourbon monarchy, and for at least at one stage, but for some years that there was no resident monarch, so it was run by a series of envoys and representatives. So there was no real incentive for it to be a civilised place. Certainly not beyond Naples, in the southern Italy, but beyond Naples. Then in the earlier part of the 18th century, early to mid-18th century, Charles III, came and was a little more interested in building up the prestige of Naples, and he was responsible for early excavations in Pompeii and Herculaneum. And then you get the later Bourbon monarchs who try to carry on that that sense of cultural building, cultural destiny. But they do it to varying degrees, and some of them are more clown-like figures than they are figures to be admired. But one of the things that happens is the Bourbon court becomes a magnet for visitors, because it's very entertaining. Because the monarchs in themselves are such a laugh and do things so well, or maybe badly.
Not so dignified, are they? Ferdinand was meant to talk like a kind of fisherman, wasn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
His wife was the one who had to do all the sorting out. So much that Napoleon said she was the only man in Europe he respected. Rather like saying Hitler was Hitler was only afraid of the Queen Mother, I believe. So
so Ferdinand was known for I think Beckford said when he first met Ferdinand I, he seemed to do nothing but stare at his nose, which was rather a capital object, but nevertheless there might have been other things to look at as well.
And Naples could be a rather fun final place, couldn't it? The way people spoke about it was similar to the way people spoke about Las Vegas now. Although when I last went to Las Vegas, I thought it was a bit sanitised, really. But Naples is where you lose your money at cards, and the women are the wildest. And
the women are the wildest, yes. So the men have no valour, and the women have no modesty.
Oh my goodness!
But it's so beautiful.
Sounds like Birmingham. Sounds so nice.
It is stunningly beautiful. That's the other thing. So you're drawn. You may be drawn to it. It was kind of like if Rome was hard work. If Rome is where you go to be seriously educated about the classical past, and really you're reading things as you wander around the ruins, you're having your portrait painted by the best portrait painters of the day. You go to Naples for a rest, so people quite often went to Naples in the winter, because even though it wasn't hot, it was mild. So you didn't necessarily have to have fires. People went there for health reasons, because it was so mild. But it had this beautiful scenery surrounding it. So you've got Vesuvius, of course, the volcano Vesuvius, which was a big draw. And getting up and down that was hilarious, I think, before they had the funicular railway. There were plenty of good stories about that. But also you've got the Phlegrean fields, the Elysian fields surrounding Naples. And this is a kind of volcanic landscape, so it's like a vision of hell, but in a rather beautiful setting. And you have these caves that emit noxious fumes, and your guides, your cicerone, will give you a little. You won't like this, having told me how much you'd like a dog. They'll give you little dogs to take into these caves, and the dogs will die because these volcanic fumes will come up and asphyxiate them, so they die. But then you take them out and you chuck them in a lake nearby, and they miraculously revive. So all of this is very entertaining.
Oh, what fun! What fun! My goodness, fascinating. So and this so much of the Grand Tour, Tim. It was so much of it for a lot of the men. It was a gigantic shopping expedition. It was huge amounts of art, and it was not just having your portrait painted, but people would buy all kinds of stuff and sculptures and art, and some of it they would aim to use to furnish their great houses back in Britain.
Yes, I mean it was the opportunity to pick up some trifles, and actually young men were quite often furnished with quite large amounts of money by their father or guardian in order to go shopping.
And that's, of course, they spent it all on portraits and art, didn't they?
Well, there were certain things that were kind of must-haves. I mean, it was always felt that, a gentleman, and this is of the, ideal sort, should come back with old master paintings, particularly sort of Bolognese school, Guido Reni, Annibale Carracci, that kind of thing. A few ancient marbles, especially if they were sort of rather nicely restored, they were also highly acceptable. Although, of course, increasingly, as the 18th century progressed, certainly in Rome, where, of course, it was the papal state, the popes were very keen on prohibiting the export of important marbles. They were forming their own great collections in the Vatican and elsewhere. And actually, it was increasingly difficult to get good quality Greco-Roman marbles out of of Italy. So as a result, they grew up a whole sort of trade in restoring, quite small little fragments into complete statues. And people like Giovanni Battista Piranesi formed these extraordinary kind of confections that actually bear no resemblance whatsoever to anything real from antiquity. These were other sort of amazing objects, and they were avidly collected by the likes of Townley and Blundell and the great sort of collectors. But then there were also sort of lesser things that people, like to bring back, ranging from, splendid tabletops inlaid with coloured marbles, cabinets, the grandest of all being the badminton cabinet, which was bespoken by the Duke of Beaufort for his house at Badminton from the Grand Ducal workshops in Florence. And that was, sort of pictures in marble, and they were set into these great ebony cabinets and brought back. And we're very lucky in this part of the world because not only do we have Chatsworth, but we also have Kedleston and a number of other houses that actually still preserve some of these splendid sort of grand tour objects which were brought back. But of course they also usually had a wonderful chance to explore, to sort of visit classical sites. Of course, a well-educated young man will have done classics, so we're, completely versed in many of these sites and their significances. A particular favourite grand tourist of mine is the rather improbable combination of the Bishop of Derry and the Earl of Bristol, the Earl Bishop as he's called, Frederick Augustus Harvey. And he, in fact, spent most of his time well away from his diocese in Derry and bowling around the courts of Europe in his great coach, collecting works of art. And he had a particular, very interesting taste in old master paintings and sculpture. And he lived a very sort of rackety life. And in fact, the hotels Bristol all over the continent are named after the Earl Bishop. Oh. My favourite story about him is that he was once in Rome. He was annoyed by the tinkling of bells from a procession carrying the Blessed Sacrament to a dying person. And so he tipped a tureen full of macaroni out on top of them. And they often lived, very sort of outrageous lives, these English milordi. And, the Romans said, if they could transport the Colosseum back to England, they would have done so. They were so omnivorous in their collecting activities.
They even nipped the Colosseum. We would, and really put it up in the middle of London.
Yeah, exactly.
We wouldn't give it back. Yeah,
no.
we wouldn't give it back. And so when we think about the Royal Academy, when we think about the history of setting up the Royal Academy, George III set it up because he wanted to create a British art market, because he was concerned that there was no real respect for British art. But yeah, we see this going throughout the 18th century, is that we have a perception, certainly, that the best art is not being produced in the United Kingdom, it's being produced in France and Italy.
Indeed, and of course Hogarth paints that painting Sigismonda, which is a kind of huge fake Carracci, really, which he paints because he's so terribly sick and tired of all these huge prices paid for old master paintings, works by Italians, and he feels that our native British schools should be upheld. And if you look at the works of Hogarth, not only is he a complete francophobe, there's lots of digs at the French and their
forks for me,
their effeminate taste and so on, but also this sort of mania for Italian old masters and things like that. And it's interesting, in Marriage à la Mode, the dissipated couple, that view of their beautiful London townhouse, he's drunk and she's kind of a bit tipsy as well, and their mantelpiece is crowded with all sorts of crazy baubles from Italy and from the Far East, and the idea of this sort of bad taste almost. Yeah,
that shows their kind of moral turpitude, because exactly. they get it all from. It's also the modern art as well, isn't it? The fact that you had to have your portrait painted by a modern.
Yes, I mean, the grandest of all was Pompeo Bertoni, who worked in Rome, and he really invented this extraordinary sort of convention of having your portrait painted. And if you go to the Fitzwilliam Museum, we've got the Earl of Northampton, who's particularly swagger in sort of white satin relieved with pink, and he's got a beautiful dog, and he's got a bust of Minerva, and you tended to be surrounded by sort of Roman fragments, busts of Minerva indicating knowledge, a few books, inevitably a hunting dog, because of course it wasn't just high-minded pursuits as well. So Bertoni was very, very expensive. But you would also buy landscapes by Panini and Canaletto. Of course, the famous Canaletto views of Venice were really kind of, extremely extravagant, splendid postcards in a way, saying, I've been to Venice.
Wish you were
bring
here.
it back, yeah.
So we have an image actually, if you just,
Oh,
to
yes.
pick on that, just to pick up some of Tim's points there. Just,
Of course.
This is the waterfall at Terni, the River Velino, and this is very famous in the Grand Tour in its classical phase in the 18th century because it's described at length in Virgil's Aeneid. And so there's a whole sort of wonderful catalogue from Addison through to Boswell, through to John Chetwood Eustace, where you go and you do exactly the same thing. You stand by it with your copy of the Aeneid and you read it. And you sit there and you go, God, it's just like the Aeneid. And that's that. And you do this wonderful confirming of the sources. Yes, it's basically, Addison goes on about how well Virgil has made the scene agree with what he sees in front of him. So it's entirely that soaking up classical landscape and classical literature. This painting actually is by a chap called Bersuri, painted in the 1830s, 1840s, I think. It's now in a hall in Norfolk because it was also brought back. So as well as bring back the classical past, you brought back these, so this is a grand postcard, basically. It's a very enormous postcard.
Yes,
and they were sort of tour guides, tourists with their classical guidebooks almost, open to read the match between a classical description and a landscape in front of them.
It's an 18th century selfie without anyone in. Really.
Basically, yes,
It's a selfie
exactly.
stick.
There's always a couple of peasants down in the bottom just to give you a sense of scale.
Give you how big it is.
Yeah.
I mean, Carl, so classes, can we connect the Grand Tour and the tour around Europe with the upsurge of interest in Britain in classicism, in the classical past, in talking about classical Rome, and even sculpting and styling Britain and its many of its elite men as classical Romans?
At many different levels. Figures like Inigo Jones in the 17th century and later architecture, bringing back a lot of that neoclassicism in architecture because they've measured the designs. They've read Vitruvius and they've measured these designs. Another classical bit of equipment for your more erudite grand tourist was a measuring tape. And you went and you measured everything, and so it's this big, it's this long, the proportions are this, and then you had it sketched, and you drew it. So huge influence in architecture and art of classical influences comes back to Britain through the Grand Tour. So yes, essentially, and I forgot the second part of your question.
I know that. I mean, thinking of, say, I think Pompeii and Herculaneum were found beginning to excavate them in 1745 and 1754, respectively. I mean, suddenly the two feed into each other. That you have both this interest in the classical world in Britain, but also this new passion for excavating sites that could attract more tourists as well. That you have both, really, don't you? Yeah,
you definitely have tourist industries at that end that are growing up. Whether it's Tim was talking about, the Pope starting to control the sale of marbles at the large end. At the smaller end, by the end of the 18th century, you're starting to having things manufactured for slightly less well-off tourists. Because by the end of the 18th century...
Snow globes, that kind of thing.
Yeah, not quite that bad. But, I mean, certainly by the 1820s, I have a little piece here, which I picked up and that's made in the 1820s for a sort of lower, slightly less well-off type of grand tourist who's starting to come through in the beginnings of the 19th century, a more middle-class tourist. So they have replicas done. So you're right, it creates an enormous tourist infrastructure in Italy and France to some extent. And there was a hunger for these reproductions as well as the original things back in England.
To make your home look beautiful. And so, Tim, if I'm a grand tourist, I mean, how much stuff really do I need? About 20 paintings, would you say?
Well, it's interesting seeing the kind of cargoes that everything used to get dispatched through Livorno, which was known as Leghorn in that wonderful sort of chauvinistic British way. And we know quite a few agents. And if you look at, there's a wonderful...
These are special people, painting agents who send back your grand tour booty.
Things, and they would pack it all up. And they were, English and Scottish dealers who used to arrange for these things. And actually, rather fascinatingly, a few years ago, there was a wonderful exhibition about the Westmoreland, which was a British ship carrying all these cargoes of English gentlemen back to England, and it was waylaid, shock horror, by a French privateer and taken prisoner and towed into Cadiz, where the stock on board was sold by auction, and most of it was bought by the King of Spain. So if you go to the Academia de Bellas Artes in Madrid, in fact, it was then promptly presented as kind of artistic examples to the Bellas Artes by Charles III, I think it was. So you have here a kind of amazing It's only recently I've been disinterred with the aid of this exhibition and a book on this Spanish prize, I think it was called, because actually you can see the sort of cargoes that people sent back, and it also included a few bronzes, a marble head, a portrait by Bertoni, some quite sort of minor things, and then quite a lot of food used to get sent back as well, things like olives and wine and so on.
Olives, wine, and marble heads. It sounds like
and then occasionally a body of someone who, because of course see Naples and die. A lot of people went down as we've just said, for their health, and of course the mild climate, but also if you had consumption, it's quite likely you wouldn't make it back.
Oh, you
and
catch
of course,
malaria out there.
sending the corpses back of English milordi who had died and of course they had to quite often be disguised as a marble statue in order not to excite the superstition of the sailors. So quite often they were sort of packaged up, large marble statue, and in fact it was a body in a crate of brandy.
I was going to say, well, I've heard of the bodies being actually in crates of booze, crates of
like Nelson, who was preserved.
And if the sailors got at them, of course, they could always drink the booze. So
nasty surprise at the bottom of the.
Exactly. And so, it sounds rather marvellous. Expensive for poor old Lord Senior sitting back at home and hoping that his son wasn't spending quite too much money. But it sounds like a great way of getting more culture and understanding different cultures. Were there a lot of, or was it something that was complained about and discussed? Hogarth thought that people shouldn't go shopping for French and Italian stuff. But in terms of the effect on young men, was it seen as absolutely positive?
No. Same as the tour becomes established across the 18th century, there emerges in parallel a very sort of voluminous anti-tour literature and anti-tour complaints.
Anti-tour.
And yes,
bad tour.
Well, just the idea, and there's a variety of different sort of anxieties people have about the tour. One is that we've been talking about the ideal tour mostly so far, where you take an English my lord, and you take a couple of servants, and he goes with a figure called the bear leader, his bear leader, who was his tutor, and he's supposed to be educated and everything. But as that sort of name implies, bear leader, they often found it very hard to hold these people. To make them behave, and so there's a lot of drunkenness, there's a lot of picking up of sexual diseases because they're sleeping around, there's a lot of picking up of bad habits. So there's a lot of people complaining that, Smollett, the novelist Smollett, says that what are we doing? We're sending out raw boys to make us look contemptible.
It was the fact that all the other countries just thought, what are these louts over here?
It was the 18th century.
This is kind of contemporary, really,
exactly,
isn't it? So the English lout aboard.
Yeah. So that was one strand of complaint, was the English upper class lout aboard. The other strand of complaint, though, was almost the figure who throws himself too much into Italian culture and becomes too Italianate. And there's some lovely...
This is the macaroni.
Well, I'll go back before that, because I have a lovely quote that I love giving students. This is a bit earlier, where this is Thomas Nash, obviously. He says, "Italy, the paradise of the earth and the epicure's heaven, how doth it form our young master, our young aristocrat?" And he goes, "It makes him to kiss his hand like an ape, cringe his neck like a starveling, and pay it, hey, repast, come aloft," when he salutes a man. So what he's saying there is that you become terribly effete. You do this sort of thing whenever you say hello. And this is the first step for Nash in the 1590s for the art of atheism, the art of epicurizing, art of whoring, the art of poisoning, the art of sodometry.
I'm interested that sodomy comes after poisoning people. That
Well, I think also
that's actually worse.
For much of the heyday of it, the worst thing was Catholicism as well. Actually, worse than all of those things for many Britons were Catholicism.
And epicurizing, we've already seen, is strong with these bags of olives coming back.
Exactly. And Catholicism was indeed a terrible spectre, because of course the last thing you wanted is for your young heir to go out and convert. But then the other great sort of reef that lay in wait were the exiled Stuarts, who of course from the sort of 1740s lived in Rome as kind of pensioners of the Pope, and they had a very busy court in exile, and indeed lots of spies, and indeed of course the English had an absolute horrified fascination with the old pretender, the young pretender, and then finally there was the Cardinal King, Cardinal York, who was the de jure Henry IX of England, who lived right up until the Napoleonic invasions and ended up being a kind of pensioner of George III in the end. But of course, the English kind of had a sort of horrible fascination for this rather dangerous sort of Palazzo Muti, which was their headquarters in Rome. It was best not to be seen there if you were to go back and be received at court. It's very interesting.
So this is moral panic. So I think you had this is the macaroni. This is what will happen to a fine, upstanding English gent if he spends too much time in Italy. His hair will go wild.
Exactly. But by the 18th century, the stock figure in a lot of satires and things for this over-Italianised, over-sort of effeminised, possibly Catholic,
not
all these
Catholic.
dreadful things.
Oh no, and makeup. I mean, he's got makeup on.
All this sort of thing is a figure called the macaroni, which is, for those of you who know your Yankee Doodle dandy. So Yankee Doodle went to town, put a feather in his cap, called it macaroni. It's because he's dandifying himself up. And so these are some contemporary prints of sort of over-the-top headgear, rather sort of over-elegant phrasing. I think the one here is meant to be a sort of stalwart John Bull, much more plain dressed, teasing the rather effete macaroni of the period. So there's all a set of sort of cultural anxieties about being too Italianified, too seduced by the sophistication you encounter.
Too seduced, and you might not. I mean, did anyone ever fear, Sharon, that people wouldn't want to come back?
I think they probably did that. There's a nice little Italian phrase which goes Inglese italianato, diavolo incarnato. so if you're an English person who've become Italianized, you're the devil incarnate.
Oh.
So I think so that's got a hint of Catholicism, or more than a hint of Catholicism about it.
The other thing, of course, was that in these southern climes, you could be much more kind of free and easy, and you could get away with things that you probably couldn't do in sort of Protestant England. And in fact, probably the laxest regime was the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. And of course, Venice, had its famous sort of decadence. And in fact, if you were really beyond the pale, a number of particularly kind of reprehensible Englishmen, had really, for their own sort of safety, had to go and reside in Italy. There was a notorious Lord Tilney who lived in Florence, who wasn't really received ever because he was the sodomitical practices. And then, of course, remember, much later in the 1820s, William Banks of Kingston Lacy, when he flees after an encounter with a guardsman in Hyde Park, he flees to Venice, where he lives incognito. And you could actually live, completely sort of relatively normal life, oddly enough, in this very sort of Catholic country. So that was another thing, sending your young sprigs out to Italy, they might come across some slightly dangerous and unsavoury people.
Wow. And there were some people who did set up home abroad permanently. William Gell, Keppel Craven, they lived in Naples. They had a house in Naples where they were inseparable friends, and were visited by Lady Blessington and other people. But were naturalised, so that maybe is the more positive side of it. That there was a place where if you weren't your straight Protestant meat-eating white male, then there is a place where you can go and be free and be happy. So I think particularly some of the later travellers into the 20th century. I mean, Norman Douglas is a well-known case there. I mean, he was granted citizenship of the Isle of Capri for all kinds of services he did for that island, but he would have been arrested if he'd come back to the UK.
So he did provide a sort of sanctuary. And how did so as you were saying, as we were going through the 18th century and moving into Romanticism, it became less about external polish and manners and style and fashion, and more about appreciating the sublime and feeling and sentimentality. So we saw that change over the 18th century. As the 18th century progressed and the 19th century began, what kind of impact did we have with the Napoleonic Wars and the growing Victorian sensibility?
Well, I think first of all, the Napoleonic Wars closed the channel and closed all routes into France. So you have a bit of a gap, really, until the wars are over, everything's opened up. And of course that coincides with a new regime in terms of travel. I mean, Napoleon did many, many bad things, but he was awfully good at roads. He opened up lots of roads, and that made travel through France and into Italy that bit easier. And then, of course, you have the age of steam. First of all, the steamship, which speeds things up and makes things more secure in terms of your travel. And then the railways, once you get into the later 19th century. And with that more speedy travel progress, you get tour guides and agents such as Cook's Tours. So the Cook's Tour begins to take over from the Great Tour, the Grand Tour.
It's a much more middle class.
Yes, yes. The whole it becomes affordable for ordinary people because I think I've heard a figure of something like £5,000 it would have cost a young aristocrat, which I've no idea what the multiplier on that is now, but it's quite a lot.
60, isn't it?
Yeah. And so yes, it kind of there's a sense in which the tour through France and Italy becomes democratised. It's open to ordinary people, and tour guides like the Baedeker and Murray's guides also rescue tourists from being at the mercy of these ciceroni, these bogus guides who just tell you what they think you want to hear. So they could be pointing out anything, and that's the ancient river Styx. That's Julius Caesar's house over there. And you get some travel writers that say, "Well, no, it's not. What are you talking about? I know more than you. Here am I with my classical guide, and I will tell you what these things are. You know nothing." So and also, they're pretty prepared to fleece you as well. So if you've got your trusty, reliable Baedeker or Murray's guide, it'll set out for you what you can do in 2 weeks, 3 weeks. You needn't be there for 6 months to 3 years, which was kind of the length of the Grand Tour in its heyday. And you can budget it. It'll give you a sense of how much things will cost, how long to spend in Florence, 5 days, how long to spend in Rome and in its environs, 2 weeks, and it'll tell you what to do, where to go, what to see. All the main sites will be asterisked, so if you're limited in time, you'll know which ones to prioritise, which ones not to bother with. So it creates a more streamlined process. Loads more people are doing it. As you say, it becomes much more middle class, much more available to a wide number of people.
And just to add, as part of that process, it's perhaps interesting to add that by the end of the 18th century, those traditional sort of aristocrats and young gentry men, almost some of them continue doing the Grand Tour into the early 19th century, but really by the 1760s, almost 1770s, 1780s, some of the more adventurous are starting to push beyond that traditional Grand Tour route because you've got the beginnings of more middle-class tourists.
Horrors, so we have to escape those.
Exactly, so you've got that sort of getting off the beaten track thing,
yes.
That sort of travel elitism. People like the young Joseph Bank says, every blockhead does the Grand Tour of Europe. I'll do the Grand Tour around the world, and he sails with Captain Cook. He goes around with Captain Cook. Byron, when you get to Byron, says, the European tour is the turnpike of coxcombs and virtuosi. I'll go to these other parts of Europe, and he goes to the Iberian Peninsula, which isn't really on the Grand Tour route. Sails across the Med to Greece, which actually isn't really on the main Grand Tour route. So he's quite an early traveller to Greece, and then goes to places like Albania, where almost no one's been. And it's a deliberate. So that sort of those young aristocrats, almost by that point, the more adventurous, are starting to define themselves against the traditional Grand Tour, which in their eyes has become hackneyed, and they want a bigger, fitting with the romantic dimension. They want a bigger, slightly more dangerous experience than what's become by now. Everything on the traditional route by the 1770s has been described ad infinitum. So it's very hard to find something new. So they want to be seen to be pushing into the unknown, bringing back useful knowledge from new places. And that's
risks. So you get the distinction between travellers and tourists.
That starts to emerge at that time.
This time, which is kind of still with us.
Still with us, absolutely.
Actually, it's interesting that, even more adventurous go into the Ottoman Empire, and then, of course, Egypt, and you get people like William Banks coming back and being lionised by society because, he was a gent, but he had actually been to Egypt and had actually sort of excavated things and so on, came back. It's quite an interesting point earlier made about how the Napoleonic Wars really did close off continental Europe, and that, of course, really galvanised our own tourist industry. Before, we'd all been rather sniffy about the horrid landscapes of the Lake District in Wales and Scotland. And of course, people like Wordsworth go up and rediscover the Lake District because they can't get to Paris, they can't get to Rome, and so on. And interestingly, Sir John Soane, who was, son of a bricklayer, so wasn't a grand, he went on a scholarship to Rome for 3 years, and actually travelled as far afield as Sicily, which was considered peculiarly adventurous in those days, and wanted to go to Greece and Egypt, but never managed to do so. But after that, because of professional engagements and almost constant war with France, he was unable to travel ever again, and except 2 brief visits to Paris, one in 1815, the Peace of Amiens, and one in after Waterloo. So it's interesting how it really did mean people had to stay at home and vicariously do this.
And you've got these rather beautiful pictures here. So might you take us
through
a few of them?
I've put a few little sort of morsels up. This is one of the great glories of Chatsworth. We should remember that upstairs are some of the great treasures of Chatsworth, and this is, I think, the room which I think is most redolent of the Grand Tour at Chatsworth. It's the Sculpture Gallery, and it contains the sculptures commissioned by the 6th or Bachelor Duke of Devonshire, and he arranged them in this splendid chamber. And of course, he decided that even though he's one of the richest landowners in Britain, that he couldn't actually acquire antique sculpture of the right quality. So he ended up commissioning works, modern works, from modern sculptors, Canova, Thorvaldsen, and so on, magnificently restored. And we have upstairs that giant foot as a reminder of one of the few antiquities he did acquire. That's Panini, who's the Roman painter, and it's in fact not a view of the Roman Forum and the Colosseum, but of course a kind of weird capriccio of lots of different monuments sort of combined together. And this is the famous painting by Johann Zoffany called the Tribuna of the Uffizi. She could never go to Italy, so she sent out Zoffany to paint the leading kind of connoisseurs of the day, admiring the works of art belonging to the Grand Duke of Tuscany in the Tribuna of the Uffizi. And there are all sorts of people there who people knew as connoisseurs of the day. And my final one is, this is Sir Andrew Fountain from Narford Hall in northwest Norfolk. This was his own record of the Tribuna of the Uffizi, with him and his bear leader and various other people around it. And then the final one I have is, when you bring it all back home, this is Henry Blundell of Innsblundell, just outside Liverpool. He brought so many antique marbles. In fact, he never went on a grand tour. These were all bought remote control. But they got so out of hand, and so much pagan nudity proliferated in his house, that as a Catholic, he felt he had to build a miniature pantheon in the grounds at Innsblundell to contain them all in. But that's, an example of the kind of excesses of the Grand Tour.
So it's fascinating how much beauty it created and how inspiring it must have been for those here who came to see them, who could never go to the Grand Tour but could go to his pantheon, and how charming it would be after dinner to go and see that. And so what about, Sharon, those excluded from the tour? Is this just for men? Can women go too?
Women could go too. I think in the early stages they would go as wives and daughters if they were lucky. I mean, it was mostly for younger men. It was kind of like a boys' finishing school.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like the kind of place you want to take a girlfriend.
You wouldn't want to. You wouldn't want to go as the girlfriend, I don't think. But as the tour moved on, more women did start to go. There were many who went for their own scientific interests, and Carl maybe could talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And that there are also plenty of women painters and sculptors who went to Rome to study. And there were women who travelled as we get into the 19th and maybe the early 20th century. Women who went with a tutor or some kind of chaperone to do their own little, probably a mini tour. So there certainly were women. The needs were less great, I suppose, in the sense that they weren't required to become statesmen and diplomats.
For an artist. So, for example, George Romney really wasn't considered an artist until he'd been on an Italian tour, paid for by his patrons. I mean, artists simply doesn't really exist. And I think of in Middlemarch when Casaubon says to Dorothea, they say see Rome and die, but I say see Rome and be a happy wife. I mean, that didn't go down very well with her. But you have to go to Rome if you're an artist, otherwise you simply can't do what your patrons will want.
And there'll be sculptors as well. So there are all kinds of things that weren't so available to women in the UK. But they could do them in those different circumstances.
Fascinating. I mean, we're drawing to a close now, which we're going to open up to some more questions. And I was just going to ask before we do, any more pictures you'd like to show, Carl?
I think I've shown all the pictures.
You've showed all your beautiful pictures. Yeah. And so what about What about the 20th century? I mean, is the legacy of the Grand Tour in the division between the package holiday and the lonely traveller book, in which you go and see things off the beaten track, or is it something that it's been completely forgotten?
Well, I suppose there's an interesting issue there on what you want to define as precisely the Grand Tour, because already by the 19th century, when you have a much more middle-class sort of tourist emerging, a bigger demographic of tourists emerging already in the 19th century, and you could make the argument that already by then the Grand Tour is a sort of marketing phrase and a marketing device. They're not doing the old Grand Tour. I think hasn't been mentioned, but typically took 2 years. You spent 1 or 2 years abroad. By the early 19th century, people are going for perhaps a couple of months, perhaps even only a matter of weeks. So by then, they're still often calling it a Grand Tour, but you're sort of dealing with something that's marketing the Grand Tour. And of course, that's marketed as a Grand Tour rather than perhaps being a traditional Grand Tour. And of course, that carries on right through the 20th century down to the present day. So there's a sense in which, are people doing Grand Tours now? Are they not? People call their travels Grand Tours. There have been some interesting sort of deliberate rewritings of the traditional Grand Tour from alternative perspectives in recent years. A British Caribbean writer called Carol Phillips wrote a very interesting book called The European Tribe, where he travelled around Europe in the 80s in a sort of, he wasn't religiously following the route, but it's clearly intended as a sort of, let me, from my modern sort of post-colonial perspective, revisit these classic sites of culture, but as a black man going to these places. And it's an interesting book, quite an angry book actually, and the title is meant to indicate that, you know, the traditional Grand Tour was all about taking you to the centres of civilization, and that's what Europe prides itself as civilization. His title is meant to indicate, and he returns repeated to this idea, that what he finds around Europe actually is sort of tribalism. People not very welcoming to strangers, people of other colour, and this supposed centre of culture that was the traditional Grand Tour actually is a sort of centre of barbarism, just as, you know, the Victorian explorers were busy projecting that barbarism onto Africa, Australia, what have you. So there's been some interesting deliberate reworkings of it from sort of modern perspective.
And one of the things that happens in the Grand Tour writing is that ordinary Italian people are ignored. They're not there, or they are figures in a landscape, as you said, they are the peasants in the corner. And some of the earlier stuff begins to address that. And Joseph Peretti, who was an Italian-born English man, wrote a book in the 18th century that tried to address the major complaints about Italy and Italians, the bugs in the beds, the poor food, the bad wine, and so on. But I think one of the things that you do get in the 20th century are writers like Tim Knox writing about Italians, so taking away the sights, the big events, and actually focusing in on the minutiae, on daily lives, on ordinary people. And then there are other writers who are basically saying, one of the things that the Grand Tour does is to over-idealise Italy. And he wants to present instead a rather darker view. So there's a book called Midnight in Sicily by Peter Robb, and Blood on the Altar, which try to show the darker side.
And so my last question is to Tim. It's been fascinating to hear all these, such interesting aspects of the Grand Tour, and I feel like I've pretty much been around France and Italy in the space of an hour and a bit, brilliantly shown so much. And Tim, without the Grand Tour, would our museums be much the poorer in Britain if we had in our stately homes?
Oh, absolutely. And I was going to sort of add a little rider to the last conversation. I think, in a way, although our young people now go on increasingly exotic holidays to, South Pacific and Iceland and so on, I think it's not the same. And I think, in fact, what's missing is this inferiority complex. And actually, I think I've got some nieces and nephews in New Zealand, and if you're anyone in New Zealand who has got a spark of kind of, sort of adventurousness, you go on a great tour to Europe, a world tour. And I think that's far more like the sort of impulse that was behind our, forefathers' Grand Tour. Because, of course, in the 18th century, 17th and 18th century, Britain did not feel kind of sufficiently polished and sufficiently cultivated and civilized, and so had to go out and acquire that polish. And so all those Antipodeans, Australians and New Zealanders who come around Europe and do this grand tour and end up in London and then go back eventually, I suspect that's more like the kind of, ratio. But certainly in terms of the sort of legacy, absolutely. We have here, so much of what we now think of as British culture is actually, the wonderful sort of plunder, really, from the Grand Tour. And that includes things like, a legacy of landscape gardens that were inspired by those Claudian landscapes they tried to emulate. But of course, houses like Chatsworth and Kedleston. But of course, when you think of a museum like the Fitzwilliam Museum, our Egyptian sarcophagi, our Roman vases and Greek vases, our old master paintings, so many of those have provenances that go back to country house Grand Tour collections. And I think, it's incalculable the kind of importance that the lure of Italy and the continent has had on things we really take for granted today. Yes, I think it's an extraordinary legacy, actually.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Carl. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Sharon, for such fascinating points. And I've learned a huge amount this evening, and I hope you have as well. It's been absolutely fascinating. And perhaps we could all show our appreciation for how much we've learned. Thank you so much. Now, I wonder whether we might open the floor to a few questions. We have a roving mic coming over there. Alba's got the roving mic. So if anyone has any questions, ladies or gentlemen, we'd be thrilled to answer them. Any questions? Oh, gentleman over there. Just over there. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Firstly, how many of the items brought back were outright stolen or sold without permission of the actual owner? Secondly, it might be a bit ironic, but Germany in the 19th century developed its technology and science, whereas we didn't in comparison because we were obsessed, relatively speaking, with classicism. Is that sort of a slightly unfortunate legacy of this tour?
Shall I do it about the items?
Yeah, shall I do the items? Yeah. Well, I think most of the purchases made on the Grand Tour were... everyone complained about the exorbitant prices, to tell you the truth, and the amount of fakes that were sold to British collectors. But of course, I think there was a growing resentment in Italy, certainly, that foreigners, and it's not just British, the French and the Germans were at it as well, collecting artefacts. And that's why, certainly, the popes began to impose quite draconian kind of export stops. And of course, there are wonderful stories of the dealers trying to circumnavigate those, or indeed, if you had people in the Vatican who could help. Of course, the most celebrated example of a bit of, Grand Tour collecting on a grand scale is Lord Elgin of the eponymous marbles. But remember, of course, that Greece then was not a separate state. It was under the Ottoman Empire. No one cared a fig about the ruins of the Acropolis. They'd been blown up 100 years ago. Things were lying all over the place. And Lord Elgin's removal of the marbles, which he got a permit from the Ottoman authorities, was done in an attempt to save them. Now, of course, we may view this differently today, but it's interesting that actually, had they remained in place, they probably would have been taken by the French or the Germans a few years later, or the remains that you see in Athens today are in a very poor state, partly because they were so maltreated. I think you have to look at it with a kind of historical perspective. But there was another side to the question, and maybe some of my colleagues...
Whether or not the fact we were so obsessed with classicism meant that we forgot to... We omitted to develop our science and innovation during the 19th century.
I think that's probably too strong an interpretation of what went on. And we focused a lot on the classicism because that's perhaps the most obvious cultural influence that flows in. But certainly in its classic form, the Grand Tour was about bringing back information across a range of fields as well. So Sharon mentioned the notorious Grotto del Canoi, where you practiced gassing a dog. And certainly for much of the 18th century, what you did was actually you timed how long it took it to pass it out, how long it took to revive, put it back in again, how long you pass out. You did it with snakes as well. And there was a sort of pseudo-science about it. And in keeping with sort of dictates of the Royal Society that you gathered information. So you did measure stuff, you brought back empirical information. And a lot of the Grand Tour accounts are very focused on classicism, yes, but they're also a sort of proto-sociology, proto-political economy, or how does the state of Venice work? What's its structure? So I don't think there's a the focus on classicism, you could say in many ways, is part of a stimulus to science, because as I say, architects are studying how did the Romans build this thing. So, and you know, there's a bigger discussion to be had, you know, do we lag so far behind Germany, certainly by 1800, in science? I don't think we do by 1800. The Germans, it should be said, are also going down, doing their version of the Grand Tour. People like Goethe are going down and being blown away. So in many ways, both countries are doing the same thing. So I think it would be difficult to make the argument that the Grand Tour leads to an emphasis on classicism that sort of then leads to a neglect of science, I think.
I mean, particularly around Naples, because you've got Vesuvius. There's a huge amount of
geology,
study of geology, volcanology, and the whole sense of how the world is put together.
Yep.
You know, if you have an earthquake, how does that happen?
Yep.
Where is the centre of it?
Yep.
And you know, there was all kinds of weird theories that if you had an earthquake, the centre of it was just on the surface of the land, and people like William Hamilton and other scientists were busy kind of thinking far more deeply than that, and trying to work out why it was. If you've got an earthquake in one place, or an eruption of a volcano, either whether in the south, you know, in Vesuvius, or in the north of Europe, or north of Europe in Iceland, why is it that you see the effects of it, you know, thousands of miles away?
And really before the 1830s, 1840s, you're dealing with a sort of intellectual culture that doesn't see a massive difference between the natural sciences and the humanities. They're all part of the, they will all be called science, and they're all part of knowledge, yes.
Thank you. And I think there was another question just up here, gentleman just up here, sorry. Just far away.
Hello. Actually, my question's related a little bit to the last gentleman in a way, because this image here reminds me, if you can think of that scene in Citizen Kane, where Charles Foster Kane has got that collection of items that he's just hoovered up from his own Grand Tour visit to Italy. And I'm just wondering whether there's a difference between, if you like, the sons of the aristocracy from England that went on the Grand Tour and the sons of industrialists from the States that decided to do the same thing at the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century, when they had the dollar basically to hoover up those treasures. Is there a similarity, or was it a very different mindset?
I think it's a very similar impulse. And of course, the American millionaires were after sort of gold ground paintings and so on. And I think, you know, a good example is, you know, William Waldorf Astor, who actually was a great American fortune, but ended up living in Britain. And his collecting activities is interesting that he found it quite difficult acquiring ancient marbles. He did acquire quite a few, but I think it's very similar. And, you know, those accounts of John Pierpont Morgan, you know, moving from place to place in Europe, and all the nobles coming with their manuscripts and amazing medieval objects and things like that and selling to him. And I think Citizen Kane is, you know, the idea of all these unpacked packages. Certainly one of the Grand Tourists, his name was John Mansell Talbot, he bought a lot of great big marble statues and shipped them back to Margam Abbey in Glamorgan and never unpacked them. So, I mean, I think it's very, very similar, yeah.
Any further questions? Lady at the front here.
I was interested in the, because we're in the Midlands, I was interested in the tour that you touched on that would have happened when they couldn't go to Europe. And you mentioned the Lake District in Snowdonia. And of course the Duke of Devonshire's house is in the Peak District. Was that missed out at that point? Did they go to the Dark Peak? Do you know?
I don't know precisely about the Dark Peak, but the sort of general contours of domestic tourism, if you like, are as sort of Tim sketched. I mean, in many ways it starts to really happen in the 1760s, 1770s. And again, it's part of shifting, if you like, patterns of wealth in British society. With the Industrial Revolution, you have, you know, more well-off middle-class people who want to imitate what they see the upper classes doing, but can't afford the continental tour. and you can reconstruct the domestic tour as a sort of domestic exercise. So you can define yourself as a sort of patriotic middle-class tourist, not going over to France and getting syphilis, or Italy and getting syphilis and whoring. You're visiting a mixture of the interesting towns, the sites of industry, and increasingly from the 1760s, 1770s, you're interested in landscape and the beauties of particularly the wilder parts of the landscape. So I don't know precisely, but from the 1760s, 1770s, the Derbyshire Peak District would have been being visited. And of course you've got spa towns there as well, haven't you? So that's another locus of tourism in the late 18th century. So isn't Buxton's a spa town, if I remember rightly?
And I think Snowdonia and the Lake District were really the peak areas of tourism, weren't they? Because they were seen as the place where you could access the sublime. You could feel that romantic, sublime feeling. And I think the influence of writers who created the Grand Tour as the thing you all have to do, throughout particularly Goethe, whose travels became so vital. I mean, partly the reason why Emma Hamilton kept having to do the attitudes over and over again, and she started doing them in her early 20s, was still having to do them when she was in her late 40s and really didn't want to do them anymore, was because Goethe said they were marvellous, and once Goethe said they were marvellous and you had to see them, you all had to go and see them. So she was stuck with I guess it was like the Rolling Stones still playing your early hits and having to keep smiling about it. So she couldn't stop. But Wordsworth is so important about creating this as you were saying, this romantic notion that you don't have to go to France to feel romanticism. You can just feel it.
It's actually happening before Wordsworth, but Wordsworth, if you like, crystallises it. Exactly. It's people like West in the 1760s, 1770s. The key influences are people like the Ossian poems, which make the Highlands romantic and the Celtic fringes romantic. So that's really coming in 1760s, 1770s, and it can be constructed, as I said, as this patriotic version. But again, as I was saying to that gentleman there, this is a period when lots of the tourists are trying to combine multiple things. You often don't go and see the beautiful landscape, you also go and see the useful industry. There's no sort of horror industry almost at that period. You're going to see the manufacturers of Derby, particularly as the new industrial revolution is starting. It's not really till the 19th century that you start to get this horror industrialisation. You much more get a fascination at sort of mills and forges and remarkable manufactories in the late 18th century. And so you can fuse all those tastes together.
And a visit to Colebrook Dale by night. There's that wonderful painting in Derby Art Gallery by Rite of Derby, showing this sort of amazing furnaces glowing in the night. And it's interesting, that kind of... the other thing is the Gothic revival and an increasing antiquarian interest in our own history and architecture. And of course all these amazing abbeys and ruins and Turner's views of fountains and Lanthony and all things. So there became a kind of itinerary. You would go around and look at all the cathedrals. And that gradual sort of serious study of the cathedrals and the abbeys and things like that, as well as our landscape, it kind of acted as an antidote, and I think was felt to be sort of slightly patriotic as well.
And to link it up, actually, it was very much a convention that if you were, you'll know this from Jane Austen novels, if you're a reasonably well-to-do middle-class tourist, you can hand your card in and go and see these great houses. So it's your way of seeing
the
stuff.
The housekeeper will show you around.
Exactly, the housekeeper will show you around, and you'll see.
Mr. Darcy's taking a swim.
Exactly. Well, yes, exactly. Or if you prefer the art, you go see the art. So
it's really interesting.
Like both. That was the charm, wasn't it?
The country houses were open to the public, to respectable people from quite early, and I think the first guidebook to Stowe in Buckinghamshire was, way back in the the 1720s. But really, it cost quite a bit of money. You had to tip the servants and so on. But there's a wonderful painting at Kedleston showing Mrs. Garnett, the housekeeper, with a guidebook to the pictures. And, literally, places like Warwick Castle, sort of Chatsworth and things like that were, really, you went to see these amazing objects that have been brought back.
And you saw this collection. Now, when I was in Holyrood House in Scotland, the blood stain on the wall where Lord Darnley was horrifically killed in front of Mary Queen of Scots was apparently made extra red during this period because the housekeepers and the kitchen maids would get so much money from the tourists looking around that they just, they didn't want to take them to look at a rather pale red stain, so they'd redden it up. So the only reason why it's so rather excessively red now is because they used to cover it in food colouring to make it extra red. So it is, everything, the Napoleonic Wars had such a huge impact on tourism, and it in terms of, once upon a time it was the British tourists setting off to go and get lots of paintings, and then it was Napoleon who went and took everything he wanted from the Italian states and took everything he wanted from Pompeii and Herculaneum as well. So it was a complete transition, really, wasn't it? And was it the same again after the wars, really? Not really.
Not really. I don't know. I think. Not just for that one reason, but as we were saying, that there are so many things going on in the early part of the 19th century as we go into the Victorian period. I mean, the whole explosion in industry, in forms of travel, tracks laid down, steam, printing, all of these things combined to make travel that much more available to ordinary people, so it certainly loses its elitism.
It won Queen Victoria's heart, because when she first met Prince Albert, she wasn't that impressed by him. Second time she met him, after he'd done this huge tour of all kinds of places and had lots of education, she did change her mind. So it could get you the Queen of England. Any further questions? Lady up there, I think. We'll come to you. Yes.
You've said quite a lot about Italy. Can you say something about what sort of people went to France, what they saw in France, what they did in France, what they brought back, perhaps?
In its classic form, I suppose the same people are going, because it's part of the route. And you go to Paris because the court's there, obviously, and you see a lot of that fine art. I think it's Fontainebleau you go to because it was supposed to have the purest French. So you then have a month or two in Fontainebleau and you polish your French. And then obviously, particularly as you get into the south of France, you've got massive classical ruins there. So I think it's Smollett who spends ages with his tape measure measuring everything at Nîmes and places like this as much as he can. So in a sense, it's French language, French culture at the court, and then in the south, my understanding is you're starting to get into the classical remains. I don't know if other people know.
Well, certainly we were at war with France for much of the 18th century. So, of course, France then had to be circumnavigated in quite a difficult way. You either went, a very elaborate way around Netherlands and Germany and down through Switzerland. Switzerland was rather a good place to visit, by the way, because, of course, that was, the centre of the reformed religion. And it was felt, also with Rousseau and so on like that, that there was a sort of seat of learning. The other way was rather dangerous, across the Bay of Biscay, and it was always danger that you might get captured by a French frigate. But, of course, Paris was a spectacle, as it still is, and the grand public works of the French, royal public works. Versailles was always rather amazing, especially if you could see, the King's Levee or something. And after Napoleon, the fall of Napoleon, for a brief moment, the Musée Napoleon was, of course, the thing that all the artists had to go to. But then, under the terms of the Treaty of Tolentino, nearly everything was sent back, or not nearly everything, but quite a lot was sent back to Italy, which, of course, galvanised a sort of second wave of visitors to Italy, I suppose.
And I suppose, and when you get those moments after the revolution as well, the revolution is such a cataclysmic event that there's a whole wave for 20 years or so going to see, the key sites of the revolution as well. In 1802, when you have the Peace of Amiens, then the decade after that. Going to Waterloo, actually, Brussels, is very topical at the moment, but that was a massive tourist trip within a year or within weeks, really, of Waterloo as well. Scott goes and people.
It's astonishing, isn't it, how even before the First World War was ended, they were already publishing battlefield guides, tourist guides to go to the Somme, and those were incredibly popular, not just because people, wanted to see what had gone on there, but it became quite a popular place to take your children to teach them, even within a couple of years, and it's something. Battlefield tourism we think is contemporary, but it was really very.
It's certainly happened with Waterloo.
Happened at the time.
Instantaneously with Waterloo.
Waterloo.
Yeah.
There's another question, I think. Yes, sir. Oh, I think you're going to play the mic. Yeah, we'll come back. Oh, I think the mic's gone up that way, but we'll come back. Sorry, we'll come back to you.
You've occasionally brought up religion, particularly the cathedrals, the abbeys, and so on. Was there any notion of pilgrimage at all through this period?
I would say that obviously there were Catholic travellers. So this chap here, Blundell, never travelled, but it was interesting that there were English Catholics who, of course, quite often had a rather cosmopolitan experience because they were often educated in France or in Flanders, and so they almost had a kind of a direct line. But of course, people were fascinated by it was often described as like a ballroom. St. Peter's in Rome and the great basilicas in Rome were, a source of great fascination and also of adverse comment as well. They felt they were sort of full of superstition and so on. I don't know if you had anything to...
Yeah, I was thinking about some of the Catholic travellers. I mean, Henry Swinburne, who was travelling around the 1780s, he was Catholic and he was educated abroad. And he visited the major courts because, of course, the inhabitants of those courts were Catholic as well. And so he had something in common with them. And of course, St. Peter's itself would be a big draw around the Easter period. And the roads to Rome, the paths to Rome would be something that the people would want to follow, especially if they were Catholic. A lot of the Protestant visitors found the whole Catholic thing a bit hard to take, I have to say. I mean, they would sit or stand, position themselves in services, Catholic services, and then when the moment came to kneel, they would ostentatiously sort of stand their ground and refuse to join in. So you get quite an interesting spectrum, I suppose, of views from travellers. Some who just say, "Oh, I'm not doing any of this stuff," and others who will either just make their way to the edge so they don't draw attention to themselves, or find a more gentle way of joining in.
There's a question. Oh,
I think you just sort of touched on my question a bit. I was just wondering how much the English tourists interacted with the European aristocrats. I was in Venice recently and I wondered if they actually went visiting or if they kind of had their own little world. But then maybe if they were Catholics, they didn't want to intermarry anyway. And they separated.
I must say, I don't personally know too much about the Catholic side of it, but I think they were fairly well. Often they were whole Catholic communities, as you were discussing, weren't they, around the Stuarts there. But traditionally, it was part of the function of the Grand Tour that you were meant to meet. That's one of the reasons it evolved, was you were meant to meet courtiers and important people in these cities. And it was a time when often sort of communities were smaller, towns were smaller. You could get an introduction to prestigious salons, and you would want to go to salons, and you would meet the aristocrats and the intellectuals of that town. So if you come, and because you're fairly high birth and rich, you've got a sort of entree. So yes, it was very much, whether you didn't live with people as such, but you certainly went to go and engage in conversazioni, this sort of sparkling, improvised conversation with people of all these different nationalities. That was definitely part of the traditional aim, yeah.
And I think being presented at the courts around Europe was an essential thing. And, especially if you're a Catholic, being presented to the Pope. But latterly, especially after the Napoleonic Wars, the papacy became much less of a kind of thing of horror, especially Pius VII, who was a very sort of civilized man. Some of the, those late 18th, early 19th century popes were, actually were increasingly respected. They weren't the kind of, terrifying sort of Bluebeards of the Renaissance. The other thing, of course, is the Cardinal Albani in Rome. He was particularly fond of English tourists, and a lot of them used to come and see him, and he used to sell them kind of spurious antiquities and so on. But he was a particular kind of Anglophile. And actually, I think there's some very good stories about friendships and, the sort of correspondences that used to take place, as well as the things you get quoted again and again about the sort of terrible sort of British John Bull disdain for the superstitious Italians. I think there's actually some very nice stories as well.
And of course, the courts would often have their British envoys. So certainly in Naples, you would have a letter, if you were lucky, to William Hamilton, letter of introduction. So you go and see William Hamilton, and he would, if it was a good day, introduce you, present you a court to the king or the queen.
And you see the attitudes.
And you get to see the attitudes, yes.
And be taken to Pompeii, because of course early on Pompeii and Herculaneum were the private reserve of the kings of Naples, and it was actually quite difficult to get in. And there was a special museum at Portici where you could go and look at the objects. But actually, you had to get sort of, passes to get in. So, again, you had to know people.
Yeah, and William Hamilton was also a brilliant guide for Vesuvius, if that's what you were into. So yes, I mean, the courts were really important, I think. But they were a network. It wasn't just the royal family necessarily.
Yeah, and salons are so good because there's a time of quite a common European culture and salon culture. So certainly I worked mostly on the late 18th, early 19th century, and by that point you've definitely got artists, writers, scientists going, and they want to hang out with the other intellectuals in these places. And that's particularly in Italy, there's very vibrant salon culture where you can meet all sorts of both local intellectuals and other expat English and European intellectuals who've all gathered in Italy because it's such a hub.
But of course, there were, bad apples. And my favourite story is about two brothers who were taken on a grand tour with their bear leader and taken to the long gallery in the Uffizi Palace. And these two boys proceeded to have a contest to see who could hop on one leg to the other end of this thing. So, there's some people completely incorrigible. You can see, obviously, didn't take advantage of this expensive Italian grand tour.
I think there was one at the front, is here.
Thank you for the talk. Given how notoriously xenophobic the Brits are, was there not also a sense that the Grand Tour was unpatriotic somehow? What did the Italians have that we didn't have? Or was it a kind of admission of some kind of inadequacy, some cultural kind of inferiority?
Well, yes. I mean, Tim mentioned for 2 centuries, Britain is has a sense of cultural inferiority, and I was saying with that anti-Tour sort of traditions, alongside the Tour, there grows up quite a strong anti-Tour tradition, which is, why do you need to go there? Don't come back to Italianate. Connects with the emergence of the domestic Tour, which is much more straightforwardly patriotic. And so there are multiple strains going on. There are the sort of cosmopolitan Enlightenment grand tourists who are trying to soak everything up. There is another strain, definitely, and you're almost alluding to it with those two boys, which is, look at us, we're common sense John Bulls, and we don't like this nonsense. And you get that in things like Smollett's account of his travels, where he spends a lot of time, he measures everything, spends a lot of time going, the bottom on the Vince D'Amici, no good at all. Ugly. And his whole persona is to be sort of cantankerous and say that abroad is a bit crap, really. And there's a strain of grand tourist that develops that almost as an idiosyncratic persona, which connecting it with a sort of commonsensical Englishness. But obviously there are multiple grand tourists. There are others who are very cosmopolitan. There are others who are just loutish, and there's a sort of spectrum.
And I was just saying that the whole classical thing is really important here. So we're saying people would go with their Virgil and their Horace and their Theocritus and try and trace the landscapes and the particular rivers and so on. But they would also see the fruits of empire and empire in decline and empire fallen. So when you go to Rome, you see what happens to an empire after it has risen and fallen. And I suppose we're talking about Britain in a period where their empire is growing. And we're also talking about a feeling among those young men who would have had a classical education that they were the rightful inheritors of those values to do with courage and valour and enterprise and discovery and purity and rightness and civilization that were first of all the province of Greece and then of Rome. So I think they would be going there, drinking it all in, saying, I am the inheritor of this. This is what I will absorb and take back to my home country. We will be, it's us next. We will be the great ones next.
And Venice is very interesting for Britons as well. Rome is one empire, but Venice is also a maritime empire that's, by the late 18th century, very powerful 17th, early 18th century, really starting to be in decline. And the same sort of logic goes, you go and learn from it, soak it up, but also feel potentially better than it. Britain's going to be a different sort of maritime empire.
It's interesting that Thomas Cook of Norfolk, who later has built Holkham, he is offered £300 by his grandmother not to go on a grand tour because she thinks it's vicious and he's going to sort of, turn into the wrong thing. He goes on 2, I think, and of course the result is Holkham Hall, amazing library, antique marbles, old master drawings, a codex by Leonardo da Vinci, paintings by Guido Reni and so on. And there at Holkham, not a million miles from here, you can still see this complete, as well as improving agriculturally and all those sort of things. You can see in a way the legacy of the Grand Tour, and actually it's rather wonderful the way that is. I think on its most positive side.
I think there's another lady there.
think it was very interesting what you just said about Grand Tourists, and I just wondered whether the whole Grand Tour was part of a preparation to manage the empire. How many Grand Tourists would actually end up in colonial countries, and or were they just a different group of people?
Certainly theoretically, I can't pluck from my memory any people where I can tell you if they did the Grand Tour and then they ended up there. But its function was very much to train people for diplomatic posts and positions of power in British society through the 17th, 18th century. So in principle, yes, definitely that's very much a sense of getting the polish, the sophistication, the worldliness that a proper sort of statesman needs. I don't know if any of you know particular people where you can see them do the Grand Tour and end up...
I've got one slightly weird example, which is Henry Swinburne again, and ended up in Trinidad. But yeah, that's certainly...
I think Prince Albert certainly was did a lot of touring, ended up ruling an empire. So.
Yeah, we've been very much talking about the 18th century Grand Tour, which is, really a phenomenon. But of course, our great period of empire, the 19th century, the Grand Tour extended to Egypt and possibly even India. And you think of, Edward VII as Prince of Wales in 1907 or something like that. He was sent, he was sent on this very extended tour, which included India, where there was a great sort of Durbar. But he went to Egypt and he stopped off all the way, and that was very much a preparation for being the emperor.
One day being the emperor
of India and so on. And I think in a way that's when the shift comes from the sort of tours that we know from the 18th century. The Marquis of Dufferin and Ava is another one. As just Mr. Blackwood, he goes off to Iceland, and he eventually goes to all these interesting places and brings all these amazing plunder back to Northern Ireland. So interesting.
William Beckford, of course, completely fails. He goes out there to be educated, to be a leader of men. And he finds the wrong kind of man. He came back with a whole load of minerals. They were great, and built a folly.
Thank you. I think we've got time for just a few more questions. Do we have any more? Any further questions? Gentleman up there.
Thank you. You talked about how the railway killed the Grand Tour. I wonder... It occurs to me that increasing communication networks might also have done something in that the people on the Grand Tour became that much more accountable for their actions, or would have been, if people back home knew the kinds of things they were getting up to much more immediately. Is that a feature of the decline of the classical Grand Tour, do you think?
Well, I think, as Sharon said, there's a whole network of things combined to sort of morph it into something slightly different. And you're right, that's part of it. Not least because, some of the earlier Grand Tourists I've studied, when they write their books coming back, they are just sort of news reports, really, of recent things that it was useful for people to Britain to know. That this happened in Venice and such and such. By the time you've got newspapers and telegraphs, you don't need those reports in the same way. So that's, I think, one whole part of a linked chain of things that morphs what I always think of as the classical 18th century Grand Tour into a sort of mixture of different types of tour by the 19th century. But I think that's part of it, yeah, definitely.
And I think by the time you get to the 19th century and with a kind of shift in class of people travelling, there's sort of mutual policing as well. There's a sense that everybody's looking at you if you're doing something wrong or bad. So the communication thing is one thing, but actually having your compatriots around you, I think, is another.
But also Reed Ruskin, as a privileged young man, he was sent, he went to Italy and extensively, and his writings later on talks about this kind of, Thomas Cook invasion, this vulgarization, and in fact, it's very interesting how, and Augustus Hare, when I go to Rome, I still take Augustus Hare's Walks in Rome, and it says a lot for Rome, that you can still navigate your way around the city with a book that was produced in, the 1870s. And he always inveighs against, how it's not the same as it used to be, this is Augusta's hair, and the Sardinians, i.e. the new kingdom of Italy, have ruined everything. And he harks back to this 1840s period when he said it was much nicer and the quality of people were much nicer. But I think that's it's a tendency. You just go to your favourite village in Greece today, and you probably talk to old houses. It was not the same as it used to be in the 1960s and those. I think it's just a way of life, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very common theme in travel writing, which I work on a lot. Just generally, 50 years ago it was always better. They were saying that in exactly. They were saying that in the 1750s. They were saying it in the 1800s. They were saying it in the 1850s. So that's a perennial sort of self-distinction, self-differentiation thing. Because usually it's coupled with I've just seen the end of something, and no one else will see it now. I'm just at the end of something interesting, cultural moment.
That was the last time to see it truly
cultured,
yes, truly as it was. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. It's been wonderful to have your company tonight in our Grand Tour explanation. We've been thrilled to have you, and we're very grateful to you for coming. And I'm very grateful indeed to our marvellous panel, from whom I've learned so much. So I'm so grateful to Carl, I'm so grateful to Tim, I'm so grateful for Sharon for sharing their fabulous knowledge, showing these beautiful pictures. And really, I think I've learned everything about the Grand Tour now. I feel I know lots and lots, and I could go on Mastermind and answer loads of questions on it. So I'm incredibly grateful, and thank you for coming. And we really enjoyed having your company. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much to Kate for holding the panel and sort of